Good morning again, and to those of you who are streaming. Today we gather on this Saint Francis Sunday, and 38 years ago and 21 days, the world's religious leaders gathered to pray for peace, for international justice, and for the preservation of the earth. This was an idea of Pope John Paul II, and when he was pulling it together, he called up the Dalai Lama, and he called up the chief rabbi in Rome, and he called the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was then the head of the World Council of Churches. And they all agreed that the patron saint for such an event should be Francis of Assisi, and that they should hold the event in Assisi. Francis of Assisi has captured the world. He was a spiritual genius, a mystic of the highest sort, and most assuredly one of the greatest human beings who ever lived. And during his own life, which was a relatively short life, he went viral. There was 5,000 Franciscans by the time he died, and Francis and his team changed the arc of European history, and Francis's viral nature is still influencing us today. So we know that when we talk about particularly Eastern religious traditions and the highest spiritual achievements that one might rise to, it's often referred to as enlightenment. And enlightenment comes from the characteristic of God, the divine light. So if we were to think about the being of God, what is the unseen and unformed being of God like? We would say that being is light, and it is life, and it is love, and it's all of those with capital L's, and we know about light and life and love, but all with a small l, ours, as Paul would say, we see in the mirror dimly, and then we shall see face to face. We don't, by our materiality, don't see this in its fullness. When one is enlightened, it takes part of its phraseology from Psalm 34, "In thy light we shall see light." And for those of you who went to Columbia, you know that that is the saying for Columbia University. And St. Francis was enlightened. In the divine light, he saw everything bathed in the divine light. But enlightenment per se doesn't capture the fullness of what the divine life in Francis. We would also say that he was enlifed, and enlivened, it doesn't quite do it, and enlifed isn't really a word, but divine life became alive in him, and certainly Francis was one of the most alive human beings ever recorded in the history of humanity. Certainly somewhere behind our Lord. But not only enlightened and enlifed, he was also enloved. Francis lived out this divine love that he experienced. Francis was one of the greatest lovers of all times. He was one of the greatest romantics of all time. It's but that he didn't turn his powerful heart that flowed like a wild fountain of love toward one person. He turned it toward all people and all creation and all divinity. Now, many of you know Francis's life story, but I'll give it very quickly. So Francis was born in 1182 in Assisi, and it was the feudal period where, you remember the feudal city-states, and Francis's father was a cloth merchant, and the beginnings of the mercantile movement that rose up. It was really the beginnings of capitalism. Francis's father was one of the early capitalists that ended up breaking feudalism apart, and he was a cloth merchant, and he would travel to France. He loved France. He married a French woman. Francis actually means the French one, and he would bring them back and sell these beautiful fabrics. And as you know, that Francis as a boy was rich, and he was spoiled, and he was a wild man. He was the life of every party, and he was the love of every party. Everybody loved this guy. And it came to a point as he reached his adolescence that he felt he should grow up and become a man. And in that society, going back to the feudal mindset, that was to become a knight. And that Francis would become a knight, and the Umbria, where he lived, the city-state that he was a part of, was having a land disagreement with their next-door neighbor, Perugia, where many of you have been there too. And the Umbrians sent their people off, and Francis was amongst the young men to go fight for this land. And in the first day of battle, he was captured. And many of his brethren were slaughtered, but they didn't slaughter Francis because they knew his father was wealthy, and they would hold him for a ransom. But his father refused to pay the ransom, something I think is really quite funny, actually. He refused to pay the ransom, and the unfunny thing is that Francis essentially began to rot in the dungeon. And he was on the verge of death, and the Umbrians didn't want him to die there because they have to bury him, and they just sent him home. And Francis came home completely debilitated, and he began a period of introversion. Francis had been the extrovert. He began a period walking around the edges of Assisi, and for those of you who've been there, you know it's like a movie set. You just can't believe it's real in its beauty. And as his body began to reboot, he decided that he would become a knight. There was the call for the Fourth Crusade, and Francis was going to go do it. And if he was going to do it, he was going to do it right. And he had the very best of armor made. He had gold implanted a golden cross implanted in his armor. He had the best fabric to align it. He left town amongst great heroic Godspeedness. Francis got one day away, and he had a dream that night, and the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Francis, you're doing the wrong thing. Turn around and go home." And amazingly, Francis turned around and went home and became the laughing stock of his neighborhood, making his father completely infuriated at him. So from this conversion moment in this dream, from this awakening, Francis entered into the next phase of the spiritual life, the purgative way. In the fields around Assisi, he became even more introverted, trying to find out what the Lord was calling from, reorienting his wild man life, his self-centered life, to the life of the divine. And as he reoriented his life, he began to receive the elements of the third movement of the mystic way, which is known as the illuminative life, the illuminative way. And in the illuminative way, we begin to receive divine gifts not of our own making. And Francis received voices and visions. He experienced the divine light, and he heard. Francis, as I said at the outset, heard much of the divine melody. And quite famously, as so many of you know, and some of you would visit, Francis was praying alone at the broken down church of San Damiano, and the Christ on the crucifix spoke to him and said to him, "Francesco, rebuild my church." Now Francis took things literally, which is one of the things that made him so powerful, and he took this as a call to rebuild the church at San Damiano. And for those of you who have a Franciscan cross in your house, it is the rendition of the cross at San Damiano. And Francis' father was out of town. He sold his cloth to raise money to buy the stones and the mortar for the church, and the priest of the church wouldn't receive it because he was afraid of Francis' father. Francis' father came home and he went bonkers. He was undone by the foolishness and the madness of his son. And so he imprisoned him in a closet in their house. Many of you have been to the house and you've seen the closet. The closet is small. You can't stand up in the closet. And Francis sat in the closet, was let out, got back in the closet, and he was undaunted by his being closeted. The father realized he could not break his spirit, so he brought him before the bishop, who was essentially the magistrate of the community. And before the town square, in the piazza, the father laid out his complaint about Francis, that he was a fool, that he had given away goods that were not his, and on and on and on. And then Francis laid out his case that he was doing God's word and that he had been called to this, and the goods were to be used for the service of the divine. And amazingly, the bishop handled this problem case with great grace, and at a certain point saying to Francis, return to your father what is his and go and do your business. And he quoted the scriptures, and Francis saw this as a sign of the divine, and he famously took all of his clothes off, stripped himself down to his nakedness, folded up his clothes, turned to his father and said, Father, I return to you the clothes that I have received to you. I return to you everything that I have received from you. And I give you thanks for being my father. But from here on in, you are no longer my father. And he turns and he says, the Father in heaven shall be my Father. And now I can truly say, our Father who art in heaven. So this movement of what in the spiritual life is known as detachment, Francis radically detaches from his family, just as Jesus did. When I hear stories of Jesus being a family man, I think they're not reading the book. Jesus also rejected his family because it had too much constraint. And Francis rejected wealth. The poverty, he dressed as an impoverished and poor person. That's what a Franciscan habit is. It's just the clothes that a poor person wore, and he married, as he said, Lady Poverty. And as Francis went out, he did rebuild the church at San Damiano, but he found himself drawn in great part into a particular place, a cave. Many of you have been to the cave, and I'd say it's one of my favorite parts in the whole world. To enter the cave, you have to go down, 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 and the cave is on the edge of a valley, and it's a very, very small place. And Francis spent a lot of time in the cave, in the darkness of the cave. And when he came out, he stood on his hands, and he looked at the world as upside down. And as he looked at it upside down, he said, that is what it is. The world is hanging by the grace of God. We have it all wrong. Now this is, as some of you who are following the podcast might remember what I said to the students at Kent School, the Gospels give us a vision that Jesus has of the kingdom of a pineapple upside down cake. The best stuff is on the bottom. So Francis moved from awakening to purgation to illumination in the dark night, and he burst into what is known as the Unitive way, union with the divine. And in the process, he detached from everything that was not helpful. He was not a rebel without a cause. He was a rebel with a cause. And his cause was to attach to the living Christ and to live a life exactly as Jesus lived his life, to take Jesus at his word. And in the unitive way that Francis experienced, there is complete alignment between what we might call the self and what we might understand as the divine self. There is complete integration of all things, a little bit like what we in the Pew Research poll call a mountaintop experience. The unitive way, the unitive understanding, the unitive vision has that everything belongs. Everything and everyone is divinely loved. Everything is bathed in the divine light, and that everything is a manifestation of divine life. People, animals, earth, cosmos, these are not resources to be used to our own ends. Instead, they are kindred and fellow citizens of the divine. They are creations to be in relationship with. And that's what the first four verses of the hymn we just sang are about, and what the last three verses that we will sing will be about. Brother, sun, sister, moon, mother, earth. In the unitive vision that Francis lived, he loved his enemies. He famously, during the Crusades, instead of fighting, walked to Egypt to meet the Sultan, who was completely taken with him, but said to Francis, I would convert to your way, but if I do, I will be killed, and so will you. Francis loved the cast-offs of society. He chose the way of the poor. He loved the lepers. He served the lepers. famously one day on a horse. Francis was apparently a very beautiful man, literally a beautiful man, saw what he thought was abhorrent, the face of a leper. As he rode by, he felt that he had done the wrong thing, got off his horse, went and hugged the leper, saw the transfigured face of Christ, got back on his horse, started to ride away, looked for the leper, and the leper was gone. Francis loved all created things as a manifestation of the divine, including the ground. One of my favorite sculptures of all time that many of you saw on the pilgrimage is a sculpture of Francis lying on the ground praying. He prayed on Mother Earth, and he loved flowers. He would love the flowers here. He saw flowers as manifestations of the divine, and when Sister Clare was building a convent, he said, you have to have a flower garden to demonstrate the sweetness of the eternal self. And by the way, some of you may well be following, we're in the midst of a quiet revolution about plant intelligence. Are you all tracking that in the past 30 years we've really come to understand that plants are essentially sentient beings? They perceive, they communicate, they know when we stand next to them. Though they don't have consciousness as we understand it, they have the chemical sorts of things in which they can have their own way of knowing. They know when a hurricane is coming. They don't need Google to tell them that. And in another 30 years, our grandchildren will think that we are dullards and don't know anything, and the world in another 100 years will know what Francis knew 1,000 years ago. Francis famously preached to the birds. He removed worms so they didn't get run over by carts. He spoke to the wolf at Gubbio, who was terrorizing a town. He meditated 3 days, worked for 3 days, meditated for 3 days. The animals gathered around him because, as you know, when you meditate, you vibrate at the level that animals vibrate. And this is how we get bird fountains. At the end of Francis's life, he received the stigmata, the wounds of Christ, and he died blind, naked, and basically in a snowdrift with the sisters at Sister Clare's convent keeping an eye on him. He died as he wanted to die. And you'll see in the next verse of the hymn we're going to sing, he's going to say, "O Sister Death." And so we have St. Mark on our doors, but we also have Francis outside under the tree, a little Francis sculpture. And the Franciscans, as an order, a religious order, are an order of the Unitive way. They seek to live the Unitive way. And we, as a parish church in New Canaan, Connecticut, also seek to live a Unitive way. We seek to follow the way of love of Jesus, and Franciscan spirituality and echoes and reverberations come all through the life of our parish. Francis famously said, "Preach the gospel always and use words when necessary." For those of you who are here for the absolutely stunning, shocking, best sermon of the decade last year when Lucas Alvarez, the youth in our midst, preached, Lucas said, and you'll see it quoted in your annual pledge materials, that growing up in a congregation where the gospel is not only taught, it's caught, and sometimes the way we are together, where we live the gospel, is more important and more powerful than preaching. And as a preacher, I agree with him. We as a community are like Francis. We seek to love everybody who comes in our door, and to those who stream with us and have any relationship with all, to know each other, to care for each other. As you know, we live in a world that is increasing isolation and anxious, and everybody needs a place to belong, and we are a service to the community as a place where everybody can come and belong. We are a community of love in a broken world, and we are a community of joy in a world that is completely and growing every day in a more despairing outlook. And look at our country, oy vey, right? Division and disunity. But amongst ourselves, as we gather together around our Lord, we have unity in our diversity. And we have a tremendous diversity, even though we may not really look like it. We have Christians of every stripe. We have people who are Jewish, who are with us right now, listening to me preach in real time, who follow all of our podcasts. We have atheists, agnostics. I know we have several Hindus, a Buddhist or two chucked in there. We have people with no religious background. There is no belief system needed to enter our community because we are all human beings of the same God. And we have political diversity. Sitting next to you might be somebody who's going to vote for the very person you want to clobber. And we have, believe it or not, economic diversity. We have people in our congregation who are very wealthy. But what you may not know is we have a congregation full of people who don't have money to make their monthly rent. They live in the crisis of barely hanging on. And we have the racial diversity that we can by the neighborhood we live in. We are a community of healing in a world that is spiraling down with a mental health crisis. All of you who serve on the Community of Hope, it's amazing. And Francis would love our staffing. We have a dog on the staff, right? We have Francis the pastoral pup. And Francis can do things that we cannot do. Francis visits the acute care ward at a psychiatric hospital where people's lives are very, what is known as dysregulated. They are so wound into the difficulties of their life that they cannot talk and they cannot convey their feelings. And over and over and over, we hear that Francis walks in and they open up and talk to Francis. They feel cared for and loved by Francis, and the therapist is in the corner writing everything down. We have an outdoor service. Francis thought the outdoors was the cathedral of God. We have dogs at that service. We have a pet-friendly office. Good luck when you come to the office. You might be welcomed by a bark. We have an informal pet cemetery. At 4 o'clock, we're going to have a pet memorial. At 5 o'clock, the blessing of the animals. Francis would have loved Mayfair. The guy was a joy machine, and he loved the festivals of the day. He would love the maestro and his band back there, who, by the way, sound utterly beautiful. We have to be so thankful for these people. Francis would be telling us that we should be thankful because they are mimicking and playing for us what he called the divine melody. Francis wanted to be a troubadour in his day, a traveling musician and poet. He would love the Mother Ann Memorial Poetry Group. He would love all the pilgrimages we go on. He'd love that we're going on pilgrimage on Friday in the civil rights thing. Francis made his brothers stay on the road. They are not cloistered. He wanted them to move. He would love all the kids we have in our nursery. He would most assuredly love the world's greatest Christmas pageant. Francis is the founder of Christmas pageants. In 1223, he had the first Christmas pageant at Greccio, where he got hay and an ox and a donkey, and he acted out the nativity story. He loved, compostable coffee hour, the gospel garden, laundry love, and all of that. So now I rattle through all that to say that today is the day that we are beginning our annual pledge campaign. And part of that campaign is a challenge to each and every one of us, because we as a community are asking each one of us to detach from some of our money. And money is connected to all of our lives, all of our value systems, all of our needs. The thing that Jesus spoke the most about was the kingdom of God. The number 2 thing that Jesus spoke about was money. Because if you want to know what somebody thinks, take a look at their checkbook. That was Billy Graham's comment. But it has to do with how we feel about life. But we're not asking each of us as a community to detach for no reason. We're asking so that you might attach with a divinely inspired and divinely inspirited community. And you are the community. The asking is that you contribute to yourself. And we know that it is good for the church. The church needs financial resources. Grace is free, but church is not. And we also know that giving is good. Many of you have heard me tell about my friend who wrote the book, Why Good Things Happen to Good People. And the 10 things in the first line of the book is Stephen Post saying, if I could bring one word to heaven, it would be give. Those who give, get. That's what Jesus says. It's more blessed to give than receive. And we know that together, church is a team sport. It takes the whole team to do it, and it takes the whole team to support it. And we know, as Brian Hetherington says, that the return on investment is phenomenal because together we can do things that no one of us can do at all. Can't do it. No one of us alone can touch an ever-increasing number of lives with the divine life that Francis experienced. But together we can be, as Francis said, instruments of God's peace.